Hi everyone, my name is Naomi Milthorpe and I'm a lecturer in English here at UTAS. I'm going to speak to you today about my own experience with researching my family history. As I'll show you, my story illustrates a couple of challenges you might face in researching your family history: dead ends and twists and turns. This isn't a problem with my paternal family, the Milthorpes. That side of my family are all very well documented and visible in the historical record, both in terms of their personal records and in newspapers and other forums. They were prominent graziers in the Riverina in New South Wales. Milthorpe isn't a very common name, so it's really clear who is who in that branch of my family. My grandfather Fred was also an agricultural scientist, so there's also a really visible record of his life in the textbooks and papers that he wrote as part of his work as an academic. It's on my mother's side that I run into difficulties, in the gap between family knowledge and the historical record. My mother's family name was Lanken, and through her great-grandfather, we're descended from a German aristocratic family called the von der Lankens. The von der Lankens were prominent landowners from an island in northern Germany called Rügen. From the 19th century onwards, Rügen was a holiday resort. You can see it here in a famous painting by the Romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich. Rügen is still a popular resort destination today. Many of my family have made the pilgrimage to Rügen to visit the house which was once owned by the family, the Gutshaus Lanken. You can see on the slide my brother, aunt and cousin pictured outside of the village of Lanken. My mum still keeps up a correspondence in German with one of her distant cousins, whose pet project is to restore the ruined Gutshaus Lanken. But so far this hasn't worked, and you can see the ruin of this once grand mansion pictured here on the slides. There are several von der Lankens in history, most prominently Baron von der Lanken, who was the civil governor of Belgium during the Great War, and featured not very nobly in the execution of the British nurse Edith Cavell. My family branch is very distantly related to that branch, very distantly. You'd think with such a prominent family, and also a reasonably unusual name, that all its members would be well documented, and it would be easy to trace my roots. But unfortunately, it isn't. And this is because of the dead ends that seem to come up when we're missing important documents. But also because of twists and turns in their records, like name changes, that result from historical, personal or legal pressures. My mother's great-grandfather Adolf Frederick Paul von der Lanken was a younger son of a younger son, so not very important, and the kind of figure who drops off the end of official family trees. According to family wisdom, he was also the black sheep. He joined the Merchant Navy and arrived in Australia around 1885. In 1886, he married Annie Elizabeth Chauvelin. They had several children in quick succession from 1887 to 1895. William Friedrich, who died age 1, Florence, Adolf Herbert, Charles Edward, Albert Victor and Alice Annie. In 1897, this scion of German nobility died, leaving his family in poverty. Now, one of the challenges I encountered in researching this part of my family history was that Adolf left behind him a scanty and sketchy record of his life. There is a marriage certificate and a record of his death, but I can't find a birth certificate or immigration records anywhere. But this makes sense since, according to family legend, he jumped ship. So here's one dead end, and I can't resolve it. His death certificate lists his mother's name as Minna. There is a Minna, born Wilhelmina von der Lanken, in the records, but she doesn't seem to have had a son called Adolf. So there's another dead end. Adolf, or the family, seems at some point to have adopted his dead son's name. On the marriage certificate of his daughter Alice Annie, Adolf is actually listed as William Frederick von der Lanken, deceased, formerly of independent means. So maybe he's a bit shady, I thought. Maybe if he jumped ship, he's also hiding in other respects from the law. Zing, I thought. Maybe he might have adopted these names in other official records. Or maybe Adolf is itself an adopted name. But so far, I haven't been able to find any other William Fredericks that look likely contenders to be my great-great-grandfather. Some twists, but mostly also dead ends. So while my imagination is firing on all cylinders, my research is kind of stuck. I don't know where to take my knowledge or how to verify the family stories through historical documents relating to Adolf. This is one of the challenges you yourself might face when there's no specific records of your ancestors' birth, immigration, or other events. What do you do? One strategy you might turn to when you're faced with a dead end is to try to contextualize your ancestor and to draw some conclusions about them based on what you know of their times. I could read historical accounts of Germans travelling or of the German merchant navy and try to make some assumptions based on that historical context about my ancestors' decisions. Another tool I could use, of course, is my imagination and think about Adolf as a literary character. And here I'm using my training in literary studies and as an avid reader. Characters have actions, and actions emerge from motivations. So I could ask what motivates a person to desert either their ship or their nation. Was Adolf seeking escape from his family, from responsibility, from the terms of his job, from debt or other demons? Was he looking for a promise of a better life, free from the constraints of the old world in a new country? Was it love? Could Adolf have met Annie Elizabeth when he disembarked and decided to chance it with her? I don't actually know the answer to these questions, but I could speculate based on my knowledge of how literary characters work. It might not solve the history, but it could make for an interesting story. Thinking imaginatively or contextually about our ancestors can help open up what might appear from the records to be a dead end. Okay, so let's move on from dead ends and think about other challenges that face us in researching our family history, especially those twists and turns that might send us off course. Fast forward a few years to 1914, and the Hunnish patronymic is a bit sus. As described on the New South Wales State Archives website, German nationals were required by government proclamation to report to their nearest police station, while the War Precautions Act 1914 allowed for the internment of, quote, citizens of enemy countries. Now, Annie Elizabeth's sons Adolf Herbert, Charles Edward, and Albert Victor weren't German nationals. They were Australian citizens by birth. And they all wanted to enlist against the Germans in the Great War. So here's another twist in my family history and in my family history research. The von der Lankens changed their name. And this was probably also due to virulent anti-German sentiment, the kind capitalized upon in war propaganda during this period and pictured on this slide. They dropped the von der and started just being Lanken. Moreover, the eldest, Adolf Herbert, signed up as plain old Herbert. And in fact, it's only because I knew that my pa Jack's middle name is Herbert that I worked out that Adolf Herbert was the same guy, my great-grandfather. Had I searched only for von der Lanken, I wouldn't have found my great-grandfather's military record. So here's an opportunity to remember that widening your search terms, allowing for other options and for misspellings, can be really useful if you're coming up against what seems to be a dead end. There are many national, racial, and religious groups whose names were anglicised due to these kinds of historical pressures. Schmidt becomes Smith, Mueller becomes Miller, Koenig becomes King. You might think about the impact of things like the White Australia policy, for example, on whether your ancestors felt safe identifying as a member of a suspicious, in inverted commas, cultural group. Now, Herbert went to the Somme and got gassed, which, according to my mother, caused him to contract emphysema. My pa Jack was born in 1921 and finished high school in the wake of Herbert's illness and the other traumas experienced by his uncles, who also fought on the Western Front. Again, the records don't talk in these detailed terms, though Herbert was listed on the casualty list for November 29, 1917. One of the ways I could flesh out this knowledge is, again, through some historical research. If I were writing my great-grandfather's story, I could supplement the historical record with contextual information about World War I. I could also imagine how Adolf Herbert might have felt about fighting against his father's homeland and his own heritage, and how this might have added to those physical traumas he suffered. If you have encountered dead ends or twists and turns in your family history, you're not alone. Try to think about other kinds of evidence you might use to flesh out your ancestors' stories, either through contextual research or through using your imagination and thinking about their motivations as characters. Thanks for listening, and I wish you all the best with your research. Bye.